Alrighty, so I wanted to make a video kind of going over how I do digital scouting with maps and everything, and hopefully this isn't like every single other podcast or video that you've watched on digital scouting. I'm going to try to hopefully share some stuff that maybe you don't know or that maybe you already do, I don't know, but hopefully it helps you at least a little bit. So I just want to briefly go over the types of cover that are in my area here in Michigan: swamps, hills, farmland, and then monotonous woods. I guess starting with swamps, I guess there's a lot of talk about swamps. You can read a cattail swamp fairly easily from a map. Obviously, yes, fingers, islands, other different types of shrubbery that sticks out that a deer might bed in, any kind of high ground. So I look for like real obvious stuff like cropland that's close to a swamp, or maybe the public land that I'm hunting, the swamp butts up to cropland. That's a real good spot to just go check right off the bat. Like usually there's a good amount of deer sign there because that's where a lot of deer will congregate. And you can go ahead and read the sign and figure out for yourself right away if there's bucks in there that you want to chase. Might save you a lot of time. I will say when it comes to cattail swamps, because of the fact that they're so easy to read from a map, a lot of the obvious potential bedding spots are hunted hard. At least the cattail swamps that I've been to and have scouted. Islands, there's stands all over islands. There's stands all over different fingers of hardwoods that are jutting out or fingers of swamp that are coming in. One particular bed that I found, there was an island that was getting hunted. There was tree stands on it and whatnot. And then a predominant wind in my area is a west wind. And if you were to take a line and draw, go east directly from that island and then up along the back edge of the swamp, there were just a few little trees scattered up in there, and there was a buck bed in there. He was bedding there so that he could monitor that island with his nose, and then he could work in later after dark. If you're hunting an area that has a lot of those, type of swampy terrain and areas, you got to think outside the box. Don't just listen to what everyone says about, islands and fingers, and you got to find out where the big buck wants to be. And in pressured areas, it's not going to be where other hunters are, I'll tell you that. So you just got to kind of get sneaky. Deer usually will bed with a wind and noise advantage. The noise advantage is that they can get in the middle of a bunch of reeds and hear things coming before it gets to them. Then with a wind advantage, they'll always try to position themselves downwind of whatever human pressure or activity is going on, or downwind from other deer, or whatever the case may be. I stalked a buck this past year and I got to within like 5 yards of him, just ridiculously close. Unfortunately, I didn't get a shot. But it was fun, and it was a good experience. But he was bedding underneath of a bush out in the middle of a whole bunch of cattails. And it took me 4 hours from when I put my first foot down in that cattail swamp to where I got within 5 yards. And I think I only had it was probably 35 yards of actual ground that I had to cover. But because of the fact those cattails were so loud, it was insane. They were crackly, you could snap them off. They were not green whatsoever. So they were really, really loud, and that buck was not expecting anything to be able to sneak up on him in that cattail swamp. I was able to, with wind and stuff, moving when the wind's blowing and whatnot, but it was very, very hard. Back in the day, I would go and set up in these cattail swamps, and I would just kind of casually walk in there and get up in my tree, and I was always frustrated because nothing would move all evening, and then right as soon as it got dark I could hear deer standing up 5-10 yards away from me, and that's because they heard me come in. One other thing just to keep in mind when it comes to cattail swamps is if there are oaks or not, if there's food or not, and that's something you can really play off of if your area does or does not have oaks. If you can determine whether or not the deer have to move for food or not, that's a big deal. I know Dan Infalt and a lot of those guys will hunt, they'll find the oaks in areas that don't have a lot of oaks, and they know that the deer will go there to eat, and that's super smart. I don't always think about that because I'm not looking at the trees and stuff, but that's something that I definitely need to work on. So the other type of swamp that I want to touch on is softwood swamps, which is essentially, you got you know, a whole bunch of trees, and then they're all underwater. So you've got, you know, 1.5 feet, 2 foot of water, and it's just kind of a mucky forest, and you have higher parts of the forest, and then you have the low, nasty, mucky type parts of the forest. I know in some parts of the Midwest, that's people refer to them as cedar swamps if they've got cedars in them. Around my area, they don't have cedars in them, but they're the same. It's the same concept. With those kind of swamps, you can kind of play them the same way by looking for fingers and islands and stuff. The difference is that doesn't show up on a lot of mapping systems. So on Onyx, you're not going to see it on summertime imagery. So you're gonna have to go dive into Google Earth and use that slider and go and look at past imagery and find one that's been taken during a fall, you know, period or something where the leaves are off. And then the darker shaded areas are gonna be where the standing water is, and the lighter areas are where it's not. So you should be able to tell and see that transition line of where all the low wet stuff is and where the dry stuff is. And then that will hopefully help you to be able to get in there, walk some of those transition lines, and then, you know, find sign from there. Second, hills. So if you're hunting in a hilly area, you probably already know a lot of this. What I found personally, obviously you have leeward ridge edges or ridge sides, which essentially is where the wind is coming over the top, and the thermals will be coming up in the morning, and it just creates a swirl. It's like where the wind swirls, essentially, and a lot of times the bucks will cruise on that side because they can smell the most. I think that concept really expands into a lot of hill country in all sorts of circumstances. I've seen it where the wind will come up a draw while it's blowing over the top, and whether it's the side of a ridge or the point of a draw or wherever it is, you can get into some of those and drop, you know, milkweed and see what it does and kind of get an idea for what the wind's doing. But in hill country, deer bed by the wind like majorly. Like it's one of the most important factors of where they're going to bed. If you're hunting bluff country like in Wisconsin, west central Wisconsin, deer will bed with a visual advantage most of the time. I can't tell you how many times I've walked in and, you know, whether it's Wisconsin or wherever, and I've you know, walked the whole property hunting it throughout the week, and then I found the biggest buck bed overlooking the parking lot of where I just parked my car the last 5 days and walked in. And I've seen it over and over and over. Those big deer like to monitor the activity, and so a visual advantage is huge when it comes to the big hill country. Around me, I don't have hills that big, and the deer don't always bed with like a huge visual advantage. Most of the time, they're going to bed wherever the cover is. So that's another thing. If you're hunting areas, it's real easy to figure out if the deer are going to bed, you know, in the low cuts, or if they're going to bed on the top of the ridges, because it really just depends on where the cover's at. If there's a higher stem count on the top of the ridges, you're most likely going to be finding the deer on the leeward side, on benches. You know, they're going to be up high. But if, you know, the cover's more open up top and you have a lot of thicker stuff down at the bottom, then you want to be going and looking at cuts, draws, you know, the head of ditches and stuff like that, where the deer are going to hunker down and they're going to let that wind kind of let them know what's going on and use the cover as escape routes. I just recently scouted a spot here in Michigan, and it was that exact scenario where the cover was in the bottoms, the tops were fairly open, and I found a buck bed right at the head of a ditch, essentially. And what they could do is the wind was coming over the top. He had a bunch of logs behind his bed, so nothing was going to get to him from the backside. And if anything did come from the backside, he'd smell them first, and then he could just drop right down that ditch and peel up any side that he wanted and be able to get away from things. And it was so thick in that ditch that you really would never be able to see him under, you know, probably most circumstances. Plus that ditch led down to some crop fields, so it was just like an absolute killer setup for him. Thirdly, farmland. Obviously, deer are creatures of the edge. You know, they like transitions. You know, keep an eye out on your maps for ponds, for fence rows, drainage ditches, all that kind of stuff is going to be, deer highways. Bucks will bed. They'll use ditches and drainage ditches for travel, creek beds for travel. They like to bed up against, all sorts of stuff, edges of ponds. They'll bed up against a hedgerow, anywhere where they can have an advantage. You just always got to think strategical advantage, not necessarily typical bedding, but strategical advantage. I hunted a piece of farmland for a long time, and I would always walk down a fence row that was right in the middle of two big, huge cornfields, and I'd walk that fence row all the way back to kind of like a pond where it opened up, and it was a fairly large pond, probably about a half acre or so, and I'd walk around, skirt the pond, and then I'd go back to the woods, because there was a fairly sizable chunk of woods that ran down the stretch of farmland. And I would go and hunt in those woods, and every single time that I'd walk this fence row, I'd cut big tracks. And it got me excited, and I was like, oh, there's a big buck in here, like the big tracks were always coming out of the corn, and then they would just kind of meander around and then cut back in somewhere, going towards the woods. They'd be all around the pond, and so I knew there was a big buck in there, but I really didn't know what I was doing or how to hunt them. And one evening, I was sitting in my stand, and I heard a deer sloshing around in that pond, thrashing around, grunting, just making a huge ruckus. And so I grabbed my grunt call out, and I grunted him all the way under my tree. And of course, by then there was no legal shooting light left. But it was an experience I never forgot, because I realized that buck was bedding out in the middle of this cornfield, and then he was coming into the woods at night to go check, scent check for does and all that other stuff. But he was bedding out in the middle of the corn, and how do you determine that? So that's one of those situations where you just got to be smart when you read sign, when you see tracks. Don't think about typical stuff. When you're hunting pressured areas, a deer is going to bed where he's safe, where he's away from people, and then he's going to go socialize. He's going to go find the other deer at night a lot of times, and he'll make his way in there, making sure that he's safe. And a lot of times he'll end up crossing your path and scent checking a lot of the areas that we all walk to get to our spots on his way. There's a piece of property that I've hunted for years, and I never realized that by walking down the edge of the field, I was letting every single deer in that area know that I was hunting there, because years and years later, I'd observed deer that would cut right through the middle of the field and then go right into the woods, and then they would meander down the edge later, but that was only because they were scent checking it, trying to see where all the other deer were and stuff like that. And I was busting stuff left and right. But turns out there's a creek that paralleled that field edge, and I could have been walking that creek in every single time and leaving and having a scent-free entrance and exit. But I never did that. And every time that I would go in there and hunt, I'd see deer that would hit my trail and they'd lock up. And it was just, it was a classic situation of the deer are walking right where you're walking. And you got to be really careful about that with farm country, because since deer are creatures of the edge, humans are also creatures of the edge. We walk in very similar, transitional areas to go to different areas. And a lot of times we can screw ourselves over by leaving our scent pretty much everywhere and letting all the big bucks know that we're there. There's quite a few cornfields that I've hunted, woods that are butt up to cornfield, and a really good thing, easy thing that you can do is walk right down the middle of that cornfield and, avoid that edge at all costs. Don't leave your scent there. Cut that cornfield right down the middle and then pop out right where your stand's at. And then that will allow the deer to come out, start to filter down that edge without getting spooked right away or cutting your scent and locking up and that kind of thing. And then fourthly, we got monotonous woods. So there's a lot of woods that I found in Michigan where you look at a map and it's nothing special. There's not any huge croplands that are nearby. There's not any real great, major hill, type of topography that you can read on a map. And there's not any terrain breaks. There's not any cover differences. And a lot of times you can overlook those spots. And I've actually gone in and scouted them before, and just got discouraged because it was just little hill after little hill, and they're all thick. They all are briars everywhere. And not only is it, you know, confusing because you don't really know where the deer are, what they're doing, or why they're doing anything, but it's frustrating because, I mean, I'm literally like tearing my legs up just trying to get through this stuff. I gave up on that spot, never hunted it, and then my buddy went in there and he was squirrel hunting and he jumps this big buck, and then he told me about it and I was like, you're kidding. And so I went back in there and I did a little more thorough scouting job, and I found a bunch of deer sign, trails, and jumped some deer, and it's probably a pretty good spot that, you know, somebody could sit and kill a good deer. That's one of those situations where it's just always good to remember that deer spend like 90% of their life in 10% of the woods, and it's really about finding that 10%. In that situation, I could have looked at it and been like, okay, where's all the south-facing slopes? Because a lot of times that's where deer spend, you know, a good amount of their time. And then the only other thing really that you can do is just follow deer trails, and then when you see sign, ask yourself why. And if the sign isn't where the bedding is, well then say, well, they're obviously bedding somewhere. You know, this was made by a buck coming from his bed from some area, some location, so you just got to try to backtrack it. And it can be frustrating and tough, but once you can find where that deer is coming from, a lot of times you can find an area that isn't getting hunted by a lot of other people because they're experiencing the same thing that you're experiencing, which is being frustrated about an area that is very hard to read. But if you can figure it out, I think that could be a really, really good spot that might not get too much pressure, and, you know, you could have success on multiple years in a row. That's pretty much all I got for map scouting. I think a lot of it is just experience. Like once you do this over and over and over and you start to realize like what you're looking for, you can kind of get just a general feel for like, is this a big buck area or no? Because once you see a few big buck beds, you're gonna be like, okay, I know why he's here. And then after a while, you can just look at a spot and say, yeah, he'll be here, or nah, he's not gonna be here. And it just makes scouting like much, much quicker and more efficient. I'm hunting here in Michigan, so if you're from Michigan, I've probably already walked a lot of the same kind of stuff that you're hunting, and I'd love to try to help you figure stuff out better. If you're from another state, PA, Wisconsin, whatever, I've hunted a lot of different types of terrain, and I'd love to try to help you figure out either, you know, how to find more bucks, how to find better spots, more better spots. I love scouting. This is the time of year where I'm just pouring myself over maps and, you know, out as much as I can trying to find spots and stuff. Subscribe if you want more videos like this one, or videos that are better than this one, because this one probably sucked. And I'll catch you guys in the next one.